Thank you, Sven, and everybody. Thank you for being here. Well, this will be a short lecture, of course, 20 minutes to cover a very complex and a very interesting topic, the connection between aging, health, and diet, and so on. This is a general lecture, so not a very scientific lecture, because we have a mixed audience, so I will keep it as interesting as possible. And let's, of course, first start with this slide with the future of biogerontology. I think this field has a very bright future, because the potential is tremendous, because most diseases in our society are in fact diseases of aging, cardiovascular disease, dementia, Alzheimer for example, then diabetes type 2 and so on. So there is a lot of potential here. If you study biogerontology, you study aging, you in fact target all those diseases at the same moment. And of course, the future can even look more bright if we look a little bit further in the coming decades. Biogerontology will develop new ways of not only slowing down the aging process, but even reversing the aging process in some way. For example, Alzheimer vaccinations, where let's say the amyloid protein deposits in the brain can be cleared away, so that we don't only slow down the advent of this disease, but can even reverse it. And then, for example, mitochondrial rejuvenation, also very interesting. And, for example, lysosomal enzyme therapies, which clear up the garbage in the cells, which have also tremendous potential, and of which the proof of concept has already been delivered for metabolic diseases like Gaucher's disease, where, for example, sericin can clear up this mess. But of course, this is the future. This will be something for the coming decades. And at this moment, in this time, the best intervention that we have to delay the aging process, or at least to reduce our risk of aging-related diseases, is food and lifestyle in general, exercise. I put exercise between brackets. For example, it can have a very profound influence on our health. I quote a lecture or a study from the Lancet journal, of which people who are in their 50s start to exercise, they have a 62% reduction in Alzheimer's disease. And other studies show the same percentages. So very interesting exercise, so not to be ignored, but the main focus I think should be on food, because that this even has a more profound impact on health and aging-related diseases. But of course, if we speak about food and aging, then the first thing that comes to mind for many people are antioxidants, because many people they believe that antioxidants slow down the aging process. But of course, study after study shows that that's not exactly the case. For example, how do we know that? Well, dozens of animal studies for the last decades have shown that if you give mice or rats or other lab animals antioxidants in all kinds of doses, in all kinds of ways, injecting orally and so on, well, those mice or those lab animals, they don't live longer, unfortunately enough. The same for humans. There have been trials with 230,000 patients which were given antioxidants like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, coenzyme Q10 and so on. Well, those patients, they didn't live longer. Some even died a little bit earlier. So we know that antioxidants don't exactly slow down aging. Of course, I'm not against food supplements, because, for example, University of Harvard recommends a daily intake of food supplements or vitamins, just to make sure that you have enough of them. But taking extra antioxidants and so on to postpone or delay the aging process, unfortunately, doesn't exactly work. But then we can ask ourselves the question, we know, for example, that vegetables or fruit juice or other dietary compounds can slow down or reduce the risk of aging. And then they often say that this is because of antioxidants, but that's not exactly the case. The reason why vegetables are healthy, or why fruit is healthy, for example, is not exactly because they contain antioxidants, but because they contain slightly toxic compounds which are often called antioxidants, but in fact work via another mechanism, and that is because this slight toxicity of these compounds which activate our natural cellular defense mechanisms, which makes us more stronger or more, let's say, less prone to aging-related diseases. I give an example, for example, coffee. Is coffee a healthy beverage? Well, coffee seems to be quite healthy, of course, in moderation. And why should that be? Because studies have shown that coffee can reduce the risk of diabetes type 2, it can reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and cardiovascular disease, and a lot of cancers. Of course, there are also disadvantages of coffee. It increases your risk of osteoporosis, and it can cause heart rhythm problems and so on. But those disadvantages, they don't outweigh the advantages of coffee. And in moderation, it seems to be a quite healthy beverage. And why is that? Well, many people say because coffee contains antioxidants. Well, not exactly. Bijvoorbeeld coffee, it contains compounds, slightly toxic compounds, which activate an important protein in the cell, which is NRF2, as you can see. Or I'm trying to well, you can see NRF2, it's an important protein like this, and it's activated, it goes to the cell nucleus, and there it activates phase 2 enzymes and antioxidant proteins. So those are proteins and antioxidant compounds of the body itself, and not externally like a food supplement or so on, but it's the own defense mechanisms of the body are being activated by those slightly toxic compounds. The same, for example, for alcohol. Large studies have shown that alcohol, of course in moderation, can reduce the risk of a heart attack with almost 30%. That's a lot. Researchers were quite dumbfounded by this percentage. But alcohol is not only slightly toxic, it's reasonably toxic. And that also explains why the daily allowances or recommendations for alcohol are very low. Maximum 2 units of alcohol a day for men, and 1 unit of alcohol a day for women. Why 1 unit for women? Well, for example, because research has shown that if women take 2 units of alcohol, the risk of cancer or of breast cancer rises with 25%. So, to put it shortly, alcohol can be healthy, but because it's not only slightly toxic, but reasonably toxic. And then, interestingly, in those studies, they have shown that it isn't important, or it doesn't matter what kind of alcohol you take. For example, many people believe that red wine is good and that it's better for the heart. Well, because it contains, for example, resveratrol. Well, that's not exactly the case, because the study has shown that whether it's a red wine or a unit of beer or a unit of cognac and so on, you have this 30% reduction. So resveratrol doesn't really seem to play a major role in the health benefits of alcohol, and that is because resveratrol is not that very important in wine. But nevertheless, we shouldn't do away with resveratrol at all, because other studies have shown, for example, in Nature, that if you give mice very high doses of resveratrol, they don't make the mice live longer, but they enable the mice to buy back the time they have lost by living more unhealthy. For example, you can see you have mice fed on an unhealthy diet, and that's the red line, and of course they die a lot sooner. But if you give the mice on an unhealthy diet the resveratrol in very high doses, so you have a discrepancy. Those mice live longer, but they don't live extra longer compared to the mice with a standard diet. So, to put it briefly, resveratrol in red wine, it's not that important, because the health effects which were shown in this study were, of course, obtained by very large doses of resveratrol. To have the same amount of resveratrol as the mice in this study, you should consume or drink 30 to 100 bottles of wine. So that can be easily ignored. So red wine is not healthy because of the resveratrol, but because it contains very slight toxic compounds. But nevertheless, resveratrol can still be an interesting compound if you live, for example, unhealthy. Then another interesting compound is, for example, curcumin. Studies or preliminary studies have shown that at least in lab animals, curcumin can delay a little bit the processes in the brain which lead to Alzheimer's disease, protein agglomeration inside and outside of the brain cells. And of course many people say that's because curcumin is an antioxidant. Well, not exactly. For example, you can see the structure of the formula of this molecule of curcumin. It's a very symmetrical molecule with two polar phenyl groups, and that makes the protein sticky in a way, and it sticks to the proteins in the brain, which normally should conglomerate together and which cause Alzheimer. But the curcumin, it wriggles through it so that the molecules, they can't assemble or conglomerate together to form those protein deposits. So it's a structural way it's in a structural way that the curcumin can delay in, for example, lab animals the onset of this protein agglomeration. For example, a study in the Journal of Neuroscience has shown that mice given curcumin, they have 30% less protein agglomeration inside the brains compared with mice which don't get curcumin. And of course, curcumin also works via other mechanisms. For example, it can reduce the activity of nuclear factor kappa beta, which is an important protein involved in inflammatory pathways and so on. So, in other words, antioxidants, they are often used as a magical word to explain everything away. For things are healthy because it's an antioxidant. Well, not exactly. The story is often more complex. Also the same for vegetables. Here you see the results of a study published in Nature. And for example, vegetables are very healthy because they contain also those slightly toxic compounds which can reduce your risk of a heart attack substantially. For example, you can see the green leafy vegetables, they can reduce your risk of a heart attack with 30% or even more. Interestingly, also you see, for example, raw vegetables. They reduce the risk with an average of 15%, but cooked vegetables do this with 30%. That goes a bit against the popular thought of the raw food movement, where you should eat your vegetables as raw as possible. Well, not exactly. For example, if you cook your vegetables, you still get a substantial or even a better reduction of your risk of a heart attack. And then of course carbohydrates, also important in food, in aging-related diseases and so on. For example, large studies have shown that even if you drink 1 soda a day, you have 43% more risk of a heart attack, and 1 soda a day doubles your risk of type 2 diabetes. And once you have type 2 diabetes, well, your risk of a heart attack increases 4 to 5-fold. That is a tremendous increase in cardiovascular disease risk. And of course, when we speak of sugars, and not sugars are all created equally, it's also very important in food and in a healthy eating habit. And of course, many studies which look into detail what makes people live longer or more healthier. And something that always comes back in those large studies are, of course, fibers. And fibers are sugars which can't be digested, at least not by our own cells. But for example, many fibers can be broken down by the bacteria which live inside our guts. And they break down, for example, those fibers into short-chain fatty acids, which can influence the metabolism of the body. And studies have shown very interesting results with just eating more fibers in your diet. For example, type 2 diabetes patients who got oatmeal, who ate more oatmeal, they had to use 40% less insulin to maintain good sugar levels. Of course, if you add more fibers to a diet, according to a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, those type 2 diabetes patients had substantially lower sugar peaks in their blood. So very interesting. And even if you give diabetes patients a very tough or strict fiber-rich, low glycemic index, vegetable-based diet, you can even reverse diabetes, sort of speak, because, for example, in this study, 8 weeks following this diet has been shown to not only reduce the fatty infiltration of the pancreas and the liver, it also normalized the insulin resistance of the bodies of those patients, and their blood sugar levels were also back into the normal range. So tremendous results. Of course, this was a small study, about 20 persons, but proof of concept has been delivered, because as a doctor we are educated, or we are told that once you have type 2 diabetes, it's for forever, it's a chronic disease, it's irreversible, but still more and more studies are showing us that very spectacular results can be obtained by diet. Also, what also can influence, for example, what also can influence your sugar metabolism or your insulin metabolism is, for example, cacao. You got the Kuna Indians. It's a very interesting story. So those Indians, they live on an island before the coast of Panama, and heart disease and so on is there at a very low incidence, so very low prevalence of heart disease. And that's very interesting. And a team of scientists went to the Kuna Indians in Panama, and they analyzed their DNA because they thought important genes would be responsible, or could be responsible for the low prevalence of heart disease in those Indians. But they didn't find any genes, but they compared the causes of death of those Kuna Indians living on the island with the Kuna Indians living in Panama City. And they saw, of course, that the Kuna Indians living in Panama City, which consumed a more Western-based diet, that they had a tremendous increase in cardiovascular disease and so on. And of course, they analyzed then the diet habits of those Kuna Indians, and they saw, for example, besides vegetables and fruit and so on, they also consumed a lot of cacao. And cacao is very interesting. It's a plant-based compound which contains a lot of those slightly toxic compounds like flavonols and so on. And then, of course, the first thought that crossed their mind is the cacao perhaps also responsible, next to the vegetables and so on, for the reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. And they did some studies, and a lot of studies have been conducted, of course. And they saw indeed very interesting results. For example, if people eat dark chocolate, which contains at least 70% of cacao, then they see that you have a reduction in your blood pressure compared to white chocolate, which gives no single reduction, of course. But for example, your insulin response, which is very interesting, you have no effect with white chocolate, for example, but if you give people black chocolate, you have seen that your insulin response doubles. And that's very interesting because this insulin response is involved in many aging-related diseases, from diabetes to cardiovascular disease and so on. Of course, these were small studies, but studies that couldn't be ignored, because those studies were conducted in pre-diabetes patients, which have the bad reputation that they respond very badly on, for example, blood pressure lowering drugs, but with, for example, cacao, the blood pressure could be lowered. But of course, other studies have been conducted, and for example, a meta-analysis in the British Medical Journal with 114,000 participants has shown, for example, that people who eat or consume a lot of dark or even brown chocolate, they have a 37% reduction in cardiovascular disease. And of course, what's also very healthy for your heart and your blood vessels are walnuts. Large studies have shown that you have up to 45% reduction of a heart attack, of your risk of a heart attack. Of course, those are large studies with health questionnaires. You can doubt the accuracy of those numbers, of course, because these are observational retrospective studies, and they are not very accurate, of course, but they lift a tip of the veil, of course, that you can at least have a substantial risk reduction in cardiovascular disease with, for example, simple food interventions like eating a handful of walnuts a day. And then I think in the final part of the presentation, it's important to stress that, because I gave a lot of examples, but the common thread in my story is that there is a new approach in food research and health, and that is that we see in those studies a shift from nutrients to whole foods. In the decades ago, in the 1990s and so on, or the 1980s and so on, scientists often concentrated on nutrients. And that's not a good approach, because scientists, for example, they gave people vitamin E, or they gave them, for example, vitamin A, or other nutrients, and they saw that there wasn't a substantial reduction in the risk, for example, of a heart attack and so on. So that didn't seem to work if you concentrated only on nutrients separately. But then there was a shift. They didn't give vitamin E to patients, but they gave walnuts to patients. And then they saw indeed substantial reductions in cardiovascular risk and so on. Then that's of course very logical, because walnuts contain a lot of different kinds of vitamin A and dozens of compounds which work together to, for example, improve your cardiovascular health. And we see now in the last years, we see even another shift to not only to whole foods like walnuts or vegetables, but to complete food habits and lifestyle. And then we can even notice or see even more important results, which show that you can attain a lot of interesting results with those shifts in lifestyle and complete food habits. I give an example, for example, the Lion Diet Heart Study. A very interesting study where people ate a more Mediterranean diet inspired, or they ate or more Mediterranean diet inspired food, compared to the, let's say, the official American Heart Association diet, which was very low in fats. And then they saw, for example, that the participants who followed the Mediterranean diet more, that they had a 70% reduction in all-cause mortality during the study, which is of course a tremendous result. It was even so tremendous that the study had to be shut down after a few years, because it was unethical to let the other participants still follow the official low-fat American Heart Association diet. So they said we can't continue with that because there is such a substantial difference. Another interesting study is a Dutch study with 120,000 participants, which showed, for example, if you pay attention to 4 simple things: you eat healthy, you are not overweight, you don't smoke, and you exercise regularly, that we have an increase of lifespan of 8.5 years for men and 15 years for women. And of course, that's a lot, and that's an increase in lifespan, but your healthy life years are almost double. And that's something which I notice a lot as a medical doctor. I see patients which start to have problems with their health when they are 50 years old. They have high blood pressure, they have problems with their sugar metabolism, they have high cholesterol and so on. And then when they are, for example, 65, they have the first small heart attack. And then they have heart failure following from this heart attack, and they live on for another, let's say, 5 years with this heart failure, and then they die of a large heart attack when, for example, they are 70 or 75. But of course, they are they are dealing with a bad health already for 25 years. But of course, if you eat more healthier, or you have a more healthier lifestyle, you can not only increase your lifespan with 8.5 years, for example, but you can be more healthier for 15 or perhaps more years. And now we come to the conclusion of this presentation. And I think, first of all, antioxidants, they don't seem to slow aging, at least not substantially enough. And of course, many antioxidants or many compounds which we declare or regard as antioxidants, they work in a different way. And that's very important. I think it's important to stress that we shouldn't always explain everything away by saying it are antioxidants. If we encounter a compound which has an interesting effect on health or a beneficial effect, most people immediately say that because it's an antioxidant. No, the working mechanisms are often more complex, and they should be more thoroughly investigated than just saying it's an antioxidant. And then, of course, the shift from nutrients to whole food and whole food patterns is also very important, and this shift has shown that indeed if you do this you can obtain very interesting health results. And of course, food is your medicine. It's a cliche, but it's very true, and it's even more true for aging-related diseases. So you can substantially decrease your risk of aging-related diseases. Of course, if you whether you can really influence the aging process, that's another question. Of course, because many food interventions they can increase your median lifespan, but not always your maximum lifespan. And that's the end of my presentation. I thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.